When you think of the Apostle Paul, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For a lot of us, he's the guy who basically broke away from Judaism to start a whole new religion, Christianity. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the most famous Christian thinker of all time was actually telling a profoundly Jewish story all along? Okay, let's get into it.
So here's the big question we're tackling today. Did Paul, who was a devout Pharisee, really just toss his entire heritage aside? Or was he doing something else, something much more complex, something that really only makes sense when we step back into his world and try to see things through his eyes?
You've got two basic ways of looking at this. On one hand, there's the common view. Paul rejected Judaism, full stop. He started from scratch. But then you have this other view, one that a growing number of scholars are really getting behind, that Paul stayed a faithful Jew, and what he was actually doing was reinterpreting his own traditions to explain the world-shattering event of Jesus.
To really get to the bottom of this, we have to put Paul back where he belongs. You know, scholars like Mark Nanos make this point really powerfully. You just can't understand Paul's letters without understanding the language, the symbols, and the deepest hopes of his time, the world of Second Temple Judaism. His ideas didn't just pop out of a vacuum. They were built on an incredibly rich foundation that was already there.
So let's start with the big one, maybe the most challenging theme in all of Paul's writing, the death of Jesus. To explain what he thought it meant, Paul reached for the most powerful language he knew, and that was the language of the Jerusalem temple.
And that brings us to this crucial concept, kapara, or atonement. Now, how we define this is key. In Jewish thought, atonement wasn't about, trying to calm down an angry God with a bloody sacrifice. It was seen as a process that God himself provided for cleansing sin and, most importantly, for restoring the broken relationship between people and God. It's about healing, not just paying a debt.
Which brings us right to Paul's letter to the Romans. He says God presented Jesus as a sacrifice of atonement. Now, the Greek word he uses here is hilasterion, and this wasn't just some random word for sacrifice. No, this word was super specific and absolutely loaded with meaning.
You see, hilasterion is the Greek term for the mercy seat. That's the golden lid on top of the Ark of the Covenant, the single most sacred spot in the temple, where the high priest would sprinkle blood once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So by using this one word, Paul is making a pretty breathtaking claim. He's saying that Jesus' death is the ultimate fulfillment of the most holy ritual in all of Judaism.
And he doesn't stop there. He also pulls in the idea of a sin offering, which comes right out of the Torah. Paul says that Jesus became sin for us. Now, this doesn't mean Jesus was sinful. It's a symbolic idea, that he took on the consequences of the community's sin, just like the animal in the temple ritual would. He's using a familiar Jewish category to explain this completely radical new event.
This whole idea of one taking on the consequences for others leads us right into Paul's next major theme, redemption. And for Paul, this wasn't just about being saved from sin in some abstract way. It was about being set free, for real. The Hebrew idea of gula, or redemption, was all about liberation. The number one example of this, the one everyone would have known, wasn't some kind of financial payment. It was a massive, world-changing event, God setting the Israelites free from slavery in Egypt. Redemption means being freed from whatever has you in chains.
Okay, this is where Paul makes one of his boldest moves. He says Christ redeemed us by becoming a curse for us. And then he quotes a passage from Deuteronomy about the curse that comes with being hung on a tree. I mean, think about that. He's taking the ultimate symbol of Roman shame and brutal punishment, the cross, and completely reframing it as the very act of God's liberation.
And this is so important to get right, because it clears up a huge misunderstanding. Paul is not saying the law itself is a curse. Not at all. For Paul, the law is good. The curse he's talking about is the consequence that comes from our human inability to follow it perfectly. So in his view, Jesus' death on that cross takes that curse upon himself, creating a way out of an impossible situation for everybody.
So you've got atonement, you've got redemption, and all of this builds up to our third and final big idea, the new covenant. For Paul, Jesus' death didn't just fix problems from the past, it radically changed the present and the future. It created a totally new kind of relationship with God.
So how does this new relationship actually work? Well, Paul describes it as a kind of mystical participation. Through baptism, a believer doesn't just, remember that Jesus died. They actually join in it. They're baptized into his death, leaving that old self behind. They're buried with him, and then, and this is the whole point, they are raised up to a completely new kind of life.
And Paul connects this directly to ancient Jewish prophecy.
When he quotes Jesus saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood," he's plugging this event right into the hopes of prophets like Jeremiah, who talked about a day when God would make a new and better covenant with his people, one written on their hearts.
Okay, so let's pull all of these different threads together. Let's go back to that question we started with. When you look at all these pieces, atonement, redemption, covenant, what does it actually tell us about who Paul was and what he was trying to do?
Well, here's the picture that emerges, especially from scholars like Mark Nanos. Paul stayed a faithful Jew. He didn't see Jesus' death as getting rid of the Torah, but as fulfilling its deepest purpose. And this fulfillment was the key that finally opened the door for non-Jews, for Gentiles, to be included in God's promises, all by using the rich, powerful concepts that were already at the very heart of his own Jewish heritage.
So really, the big takeaway is this. Paul wasn't an inventor starting from zero. He was a master interpreter. He took the profound spiritual language of Judaism and used it to try and make sense of what he believed was the single most important event in the history of the world.
And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. If this view of Paul is right, that he was a Jewish thinker working from inside his own tradition the whole time, it really makes you wonder, what else about the origins of Christianity might we have been looking at through the wrong lens all this time?